Good evening. I'm glad to see a nice, intimate crowd and conversation that we can have this evening. My name is Christina Van Den Bishop. I teach here at St. Jerome's in the Religious Studies Department, and I'm very glad to welcome you here this evening on behalf of St. Jerome's College, also on behalf of John Tice, who is the director of the Center for Catholic Experience. John is away at a conference, and so he asked me to fill in for him this evening. So welcome. Given the kind of conversation we were able to have over dinner and the topic for this evening, I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Carolyn Sharp to speak to us this evening. It seems to me quite timely, given the kind of questions about the nature and identity of this country and of the province of Quebec, that we can bring Carolyn here to talk to us about the experience and the questions regarding faith in Quebec. Carolyn has recently completed her doctoral work, and that work was focused on studying the lives of women in Quebec, working women, and their experience of God. And she wanted me to clarify that she is not the first editor of Relation, she's the second woman editor of Relation, and that is what she is currently doing. So please join me in welcoming Carolyn Sharp to speak to us today.
Sorry. Thank you, Chris. I want to say how glad I am to be here, how wonderful it always is to come to Waterloo and to the warm hospitality that you always find at St. Jerome's, and the people who are here, and the interest in the future of the church in Canada and throughout the world, including in Quebec. And how glad I am to come and talk at this time when I know a lot of people in Ontario have questions. I'm going to focus on faith and the church in Quebec, but I do know there are people who want to ask political questions, and as the editor of a Jesuit magazine that publishes in the domain of social affairs and has a very strong nationalist editorial position, I'd be very glad to talk about some of those things in the question period if some of you want to ask those questions. So I'm going to talk about faith in the church, but we all know that's not divorced from the rest of our reality, so please feel free. And let me also begin by saying that one of my experiences as someone who's studied theology in Quebec and in English Canada is that the two solitudes which exist in Canadian society also exist in the church. That the political tensions and differences which separate Quebec from the rest of Canada are also present in the church, although I believe we can hope that they are there in a much more gentler form. And so, while I'm aware that it is a challenge to speak to you tonight about faith in Quebec, and at times some of you may find that I'm going over the basics, but I think it's always important to do that when we talk about Quebec outside of Quebec, I also welcome it as an opportunity to build bridges and to enter into dialogue. As I prepared this paper, I tried to reflect upon what images you might have of the church in Quebec. And I could not help thinking about the religious geography of southern Ontario and of Quebec. In the Ontario countryside, one finds small churches on the edges of town, sitting lonely in a flat green landscape. And I said to Michael Higgins as we drove in from Toronto, "See that church, I'm going to talk about it tonight." He said, "What church?" "I think that's a barn." Well, it was a little small church sitting on the edge of a town in a field, and it could have been a barn except that it was a church. If we had been driving through Quebec, we would have seen from the distance large, maybe even enormous church spires that would have told us that we were coming to a village. And nestled in the village, next to the credit union, the local school, the post office, maybe a small restaurant, there would have been the church at the heart of the rural life. In the cities, the differences are also remarkable. Toronto has its large churches. London probably does too. One thinks of St. Michael's Cathedral or the Metropolitan United Church. But these are exceptions in an urban landscape in which a variety of small Catholic and Protestant churches serve an increasingly diverse population. By contrast, in Montreal or in Quebec City, or even in a small city like Trois-Rivières, mammoth, multi-tiered parish churches situated only a few blocks from each other remind us of a time when a nearly homogeneous Catholic population worshipped religiously each Sunday, educated their boys and girls separately in local schools run by religious, organized their lives within church-affiliated unions, youth clubs, and women's groups. Visiting some of these monuments of a history which has come to an end, you may have wondered what has become of this formerly vigorous institution. If you stop at one of these buildings on a Sunday morning, you may have seen the small group of parishioners gathered there and wondered at the difficulty of doing good liturgy in a near-empty, cavernous building. Undoubtedly, you will be struck by the absence of children, the aging congregation, the white-haired priest. And you may quickly conclude that the church in Quebec is a fading beauty, too unwise to know that her glory days are over. If you happen upon some statistics during your visit, you may, however, realize that the situation is more ambiguous. Religious practice is indeed decreasing. Regular Sunday church-going has decreased from nearly 90% in 1965 to less than 40% in 1985, and even lower in urban areas. Yet over 80% of the population is baptized as Catholics. Moreover, most parents request Catholic religious education for their children. Indeed, nearly all parents outside of the Montreal region do so. At the same time, 40% of couples in Quebec live common law, the highest percentage in the Western world. But those who get married do so overwhelmingly in the church, often after having lived together for some years. Many Quebecers restrict their church-going to important holidays and events: Easter, Christmas, baptism, First Communion, marriages, and funerals. This ambiguity leads some observers to suggest that what subsists is a watered-down cultural Catholicism. Others argue against such a rapid judgment in favor of more flexible understanding of the transformations in Catholic identity happening in Quebec today. If you are very lucky, you will have stopped at a parish where the sign outside doesn't say that it is a parish, but a Christian community. The congregation will still be small, but the church will be populated by a multiplicity of flyers announcing a Bible study, a soup kitchen, a children's choir, an outreach group for new immigrants. The homily may be preached by a middle-aged woman, and at the end of the Mass, this same woman will announce a community meeting, perhaps on the use of government funds to refurbish the building, perhaps to discuss the upcoming diocesan synod, or perhaps to discuss criteria for admitting children to the sacrament of confirmation. And so you will know that the church, this fading beauty, knows that her life has changed and that she must give it new meaning. Some of you may not have visited Quebec, and you will not have been able to see firsthand these things, but you will have gathered your impressions in other ways, maybe through the media and maybe in the library with Carolyn's help. Many of you will have heard of the strong positions taken by the Quebec bishops in the area of social justice. Inspired by the challenge to move from words to action, the Quebec bishops have stubbornly continued to address the whole of Quebec society on questions of social and economic justice. They have spoken on the concrete issues facing workers, and I must say that it is good news to hear today that in Cambridge, the number of jobs is going to be doubled. Growing unemployment, the impoverishment of working-class youth and family, the marginalization of women in the workplace, the need for new economic models, the possibility of work sharing, all of these have been found in the 1st of May messages. Guided by the work of bishops formed in the biological sciences, the Quebec bishops have reflected on the relation between ecological issues and regional economic development. They have spoken out on Native issues, arguing for the recognition of Aboriginal rights and the rightful place of Native peoples in Quebec society, steadfastly refusing to take a position on the national question. They have affirmed the right of Quebecers to self-determination. Moreover, they have refused to address these social questions in isolation, but have sought out alliances with religious communities, unions, and business groups, with community organizations and the women's movement, thus modeling a partnership which I believe many churches elsewhere in the world could take as an example. Moreover, the Quebec bishops continue to make an important contribution to the whole of the Canadian Church by bringing their concerns and their expertise with them to the CCCB in Ottawa. Undoubtedly, you are also aware of the important contribution the Quebec Church has made to the question of women. In response to a consultation undertaken with women in the Church, the bishops have courageously raised the question of the recognition of women's ministries and indeed their possible ordination during their meetings with the Pope. Archbishop Vachon's intervention at the Synod on the Laity, with the help of Mary Malone, and the recent intervention at the Synod on the Consecrated Life by Archbishop Couture have raised the question of women's equality within the believing community. And at home, Quebec bishops have witnessed to their commitment to women's issues as justice issues. They have refused to address the question of abortion outside of the context of the Church's overall commitment to social justice, and indeed without regards to the question of justice for women. In 1990, the bishops apologized for the episcopal resistance to women's suffrage. In Violence as a Heritage, the bishops recognized that in the area of conjugal violence, the Church must stop being part of the problem and begin being part of the solution. If you have seen the magazine for which I work in the library, you will perhaps have been struck to find a woman publishing a Jesuit journal. And I'm the second woman to be the publisher, and I'm the only woman in the world to publish a Jesuit social affairs journal, as was my predecessor. So it's something special that the Quebec Jesuits are adding to the company. And you would also have seen, as a sign of the times, the presence of a laywoman and a layman, laywomen and laymen alongside religious on our editorial board. You would find in the articles we publish a passion for justice, a deep concern about the growing social and economic cleavages in Quebec society, a concern about the future of politics in a world dominated by neoconservative thought, about the erosion of social cohesion and social responsibility. Moreover, I would hope that you will notice that this concern is stripped of the pretensions both of Christendom and of a Catholic ghetto mentality, that the prominent progressive authors who write for us are surely not all Catholic, and in searching for the Catholic character of the magazine, perhaps you would discern its presence in our effort to connect faith to justice and in our attempt to highlight the Church's presence at the heart of key debates in Quebec society. You may have also noticed, while reading in the library about the Church in Quebec, the existence of dozens of small groups seeking to live their faith outside of the larger structures, although not separate from them. You may have heard of the existence of a network of groups committed progressive Christians whose statistical marginality is overshadowed by their impact on the larger church and the larger society. You may hear of Christians and non-Christians working together in areas of social justice. Indeed, you may be even aware that many secular grassroots justice organizations depend upon the economic support of religious communities for their survival. Perhaps, too, you will realize that there exists in the Quebec Church a strong women's movement, and that many prominent Catholic women have played important roles in the secular women's movement. It's always been a bit of a pleasure for me that one of the founding members of the Fédération des Femmes du Québec, which is a bit the equivalent of NAC in Quebec, is a cousin and a believing Catholic, or was a cousin and believing Catholic, of Jacques Monette, Simone Monette Chartrand, a woman who was an outspoken Catholic and an outspoken feminist. The Church in Quebec is thus a complex reality, caught in a contradictory present and uncertain as to its future. Having moved beyond a triumphant Catholic Christendom, but refusing to hide behind a sectarian attitude towards faith and culture, it has thought and continues to seek how it can remain relevant to the increasingly secular society in which it lives, so that it can both remain faithful to the radical demands of the gospel and announce the gospel is good news for all. To understand this challenge fully, I think, however, we need to turn our attention back to the shock waves which the Quiet Revolution and the Second Vatican Council sent through the Church in Quebec. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Quebec society and culture underwent a rapid secularization. Let me recall a few aspects. There was the transition from health, social service, and education services staffed by, owned by, and administered by the church and religious communities, although funded in part by government, to a fully publicly controlled system. At the same time, a modernization of these services took place. Thus, for instance, in the case of education, there was the establishment of a Ministry of Education, the creation of publicly funded schooling giving access to post-secondary schools, and the establishment of the college and university system. There was at the same time a drastic decrease in the number of religious. The creation of professionals outside religious life meant that women in particular no longer had to turn to religious life to have professional careers. Large numbers left and new recruits were rare. The average age of the Jesuits today is more than 70. The recognition of women as full citizens was also part of this secularization process. The right to vote in 1940 has been called a precursor of the Quiet Revolution. The decline of the birth rate, which took place over several decades and then rapidly, is also cited as a major factor in bringing on the Quiet Revolution. May I remind you that married women became legal persons with a variety of rights in the early 1960s. This ended their legal incapacity and meant that wives could now authorize medical care for themselves, have a bank account, control their own earnings. And it was only in 1980 that the full legal equality between spouses was established. Let me remind you that overall, the Church's reaction to these changes has been relatively positive. The Quiet Revolution was seen by most church people as a necessary passage from childhood to maturity. The death of clericalism, in particular the end of religious control of schools, hospitals, social services, and labor unions, was a liberation for both society and church. Indeed, the clericalization was often the fruit of the labor of numerous Christians, both priests and laity. Undoubtedly, this positive reaction in part was made possible by the historical coincidence between the Quiet Revolution and Vatican II. Many within the hierarchy and the laity welcomed the Council as a timely renewal of the Church. They found a sign of hope in the Council's emphasis on communion and participation within the Church, and conciliar documents were seen as an important resource for the reconciliation of the autonomy of the profane with a vital Christian presence in the world. This is not to deny that some decried the situation or others dragged their feet, while still others merely paid lip service to modernization. Nor did a positive, receptive attitude towards Vatican II and the Quiet Revolution preclude the painfulness of change. For the Quebec Church in the 1960s and 1970s, the present was a mass of contradictions and the path to the future none too clear. At times it seemed that there was no future, as if the death of Quebec's particular species of Christendom was the death of Christian faith itself. Without a doubt, the Quiet Revolution and Vatican Council II has These events shook the Roman Catholic Church in Quebec, each challenging in its own way the Church's understanding of itself, its faith, and its relationship to Quebec society. A call arose for the renewal of the Christian tradition so that it could continue to speak to a modernized nation. One prominent voice in this call to renewal was the Catholic layman Fernand Dumont. Dumont was concerned about the erosion of faith in modern Quebec. As a sociologist, he was aware of studies that showed that the decline of traditional Catholicism was accompanied by a spiritual vacuum seemingly incapable of generating new religious models. He knew also that behind an almost universal belief in God hid an ethics of conformity, socially convenient religious practices, and an understanding of faith stripped of most notions of transcendence. Dumont offered a philosophical analysis of the crisis facing the Church. As early as 1964, he argued that this crisis was not indigenous to Quebec, but was universal. It resulted from the disjuncture of Christianity and the thoroughly profane modern world. Christianity's presence in this modern world is so seriously eroded that its message has been reduced to a shoddy spirituality bathed in romanticism. Its only earnest consumers, Dumont claims, are rural people whose ties with the earth preserve their sense of the sacred, and women who are caught up in sentimentality. Well, there we go. However, for those exposed to the modern world, this spirituality offers little sustenance and fails to equip men to juggle spiritual and temporal priority. Dumont viewed this disjuncture between Christianity and the modern world as an occasion for the Church to seize upon. The dislocation of traditional senses of the sacred order invites humanity to reflect upon the challenge of faith in an ambiguous world, to value history as the privileged site of the human encounter with the divine, and to explore more fully the moral dimension of religion. Faith no longer offers the assurance of answers, but the chance to weigh the questions more fully. The sociologist and theologian and priest Jacques Grandmaison shared Dumont's concerns. He suggested that the symbolic crisis caused by secularization in Quebec was intensified by the rapidity with which the Quiet Revolution took place. In a short time, the Quiet Revolution tore apart the fabric of Quebec culture, destroying its ability to create spiritualities expressive of its collective adventure. According to Grandmaison, the failure to come to grips with this cultural disruption will lead not only to the end of a religion, but also to the end of a people and its culture. Grandmaison claims that a profoundly religious way of seeing the world remains nonetheless in Quebec. Behind the efforts of different groups to respond to the crisis through political radicalism or neo-nationalism, through nostalgia for the past, or through personal growth sessions, he discerns attempts to reconstruct a collective symbolism. These efforts are the individual and collective expressions of the human need for symbolic horizon in which the world can be appropriated and through which free and creative personal and social relationships can be established. And I wrote those lines before the Hors du Temple Solaire happened in Switzerland, and it strikes me that they're perhaps a good reminder now. Grandmaison thus uncovers a paradox. The religious dimension of collective life in Quebec had shifted from the realm of the sacred to that of the profane, and he sees in this paradox a major challenge for the Church in Quebec. For Grandmaison, the crisis provoked by secularization was positive, inasmuch as it broke through the alienating dimensions of the previous religious and cultural unity. This symbolic crisis challenges the community of believers to move beyond a nostalgia for the past and to integrate within their own structures the changes required by the new socio-cultural context. These changes include declericalization and a greater role for the laity in the Church. More importantly, it presents the believing community with the decisive challenge to make its faith meaningful within the realm of the profane. I've tried to keep French out of this, but he has a lovely saying, and it's that le bateau à sauver n'est pas l'Église, mais le monde. The ship to be saved is not the Church, but the world. The dialectic between the future of God's reign and the future of the world must be reestablished so that Quebec can rediscover the liberating symbol system of the gospel. The work of Dumont and Grandmaison was crucial to the Study Commission on the Church and Laity, which was established by the French-speaking bishops of Canada in 1968 and chaired by Dumont himself. Consisting of 12 members, including 9 lay people, of whom 4 were women, the commission was a unique undertaking in the history of the Roman Catholic Church in Canada and worldwide. More than 15,000 people participate in preparing the 800 oral and written briefs which the commission received. Its final report, known as the Dumont Report, was published in 1972. This undertaking was undoubtedly the most important element of the official Church response to the crisis wrought by the Quiet Revolution and Vatican II. The Dumont's report's principal axes were the Church's heritage and the Church as project. It emphasized the richness of the Church's historical role in Quebec. At the same time, it interpreted contemporary social changes as a window of opportunity through which the Church could rediscover its mission. After a long period of stagnation, the Dumont report allowed the Church to come to grips with the changing reality of its surrounding society, abandon a self-image grounded upon stability and essences, and assume its freedom to project itself into the future. Thus, it marks the end of a triumphalist Church, setting aside forever the pretensions of Christendom. One of the Commission's central objects was the clarification of the Church's relationship with the working class. Among the important commissioners were 2 members with experience in working class Catholic action and a staff person with the CNTU, which is the Confederation of National Trade Unions, which you may have heard called the CSN. The Dumont report, moreover, insisted on the privileged place of justice concerns in the mission of the Church. In spite of this concern with the prophetic role of the Church, working class activists were highly critical of the Dumont report, arguing that it was disconnected from the concrete reality of workers, and arguing also that its preoccupation with the internal matters to the detriment of the Church led the Church away from a full solidarity with the working class. Among the briefs which the Commission heard were those of women's groups who challenged male power within the Church. However, the Commissioners chose not to integrate women's concerns into their final report, either as a separate section or within their discussions of other questions. Thus, in spite of the presence of women commissioners, the Dumont report effectively ignored women's voices. The Dumont report became an important reference point for the Church as a whole and for Quebec theologians in particular. Theologians were increasingly aware of the need for a theology grounded in the Quebec context. The imperative of contextualization opened the door to practical studies whose object was to uncover operative theologies at the base of the Church, especially in those sectors in which new models of faith were emerging. At the same time, the integration of the insights of Vatican II led to a renewed insistence upon the themes of incarnation and human freedom. In terms of its vision of faith, the theology emerging in Quebec in response to the crisis followed a double track. On the one hand, the concern for the greater autonomy of society from the Church expressed itself in terms of the credibility of God in modern society. Was it still possible to expect people to believe? On the other hand, concern for the renewed imperative of the Church's presence in the world expressed itself in terms of the primacy of the divine presence in history. Overall, there was a clear tendency to give this second question priority and to approach the question of the credibility of God within this framework. As the 70s progressed, the Roman Catholic Church in Quebec was increasingly challenged to clarify its options by working class activists within its pastoral groups among the working class, Christian-based communities, worker priests, Catholic action movements such as the Young Christian Students and the Young Christian Workers, and their allies argued that the concern for the poor could not be a concern among others, but must take center stage in a subversive option for the oppressed. Theologically, this implied a shift from a concern for the poor within the context of a church in the process of modernization to a politicized option for the oppressed within the context of a church committed to liberation. Concretely, this shift in perspective was actualized by a commitment to a radical presence alongside and among the working class. Several common themes can be found in this radical shift in understanding. First, its proponents identified oppression as the source of poverty. Second, they argued that the existence of oppression implied the existence of oppressors with whom the church could not remain in solidarity. Third, in order to combat oppression, they stressed the need to listen to the experience of the oppressed in order to identify the structural mechanisms by which the wealthy maintain their power. Fourth, they stressed the importance of an active engagement in the struggle for liberation in order to remain faithful to the gospel and to uncover the liberative face of God. Theologically, this radical shift found expression in the effort to describe the partiality of a God who was not neutral, who was in fact partial to the poor. It is to the poor and dispossessed that the good news of God's love and the hope of the coming of God's justice is addressed. This more radicalized understanding of God shared with the more mainstream theology of modernization and renewal the insistence on the divine presence in history. It also shared the insistence on human responsibility in history as active participant in God's creative and salvific activity. If we do not hear the cry of the poor, wrote one worker priest, who will believe that God hears them? The Christian God, then, is a God who acts through others, through the prophets, through Jesus Christ, and finally through the church. While it is the divine promise which opens the scandal of suffering in the present to the hope of justice in the future, it is the actions of the community of believers which makes God's presence in history real. Thus, for the radical perspective, the gospel calls the church not to a passive expectation of better times to come, but to an active hope which mobilizes in the present. The church's mission is to continue through words and actions the divine promise. In this perspective, an essential task is the identification of who the poor are today and what weighs them down. This more radical understanding of the task before the church reflected a range of influences. First, it was rooted in what is called the crisis of Catholic action. Inspired by the French theology which followed World War II and energized by the Second Vatican Council, specialized Catholic action movements in Quebec as elsewhere in the world explored new directions which brought them into conflict with the hierarchy over issues of ecclesial autonomy and social analysis. Secondly, it was rooted in the general context of political radicalization within Quebec. Radicalization which found its expression, for instance, in all three major union confederations opting for socialism. Thirdly, the emergent radical perspective found a fellow traveler in Latin American liberation theology, which offered the alternative it sought to an institutional theology preoccupied with internal reforms and dominated by oppressive class interests. Working class activists and their allies responded enthusiastically to liberation theology. They translated documents, participated in exchanges with base communities in Latin America, and organized study sessions. Latin American liberation theology was thus a catalyst which allowed the activists in this network to express more clearly the relationship between their praxis and their faith. It must be said, however, that the liberationist perspective sketched above was largely androcentric. In the late 70s and early 80s, as women sought to redefine their own place within working class organizations, the need for a feminist perspective made itself felt. The effect of the rising consciousness of feminist concerns can be seen in an Our Father written by a group of welfare rights activists in 1980. The prayer begins by addressing God as both mother and father, and includes the line, "Show us how to build a new society in which men and women can live together new social relationships." The context of the line suggests, however, that the new social relationships referred to are not relations between women and men, but rather to the overall social relations in which both women and men find themselves involved. Similarly, in 1980, the Quebec theologian Pierre Goldberger, and I should mention a Protestant Francophone theologian, identified feminist theology alongside liberation theology as an important source for radical spirituality. In a gospel-inspired parable about the choice between capitalism and socialism, the one who makes the choice for socialism is a woman. The parable clearly recognizes women's active agency in social change. However, the framework of analysis remains dominated by an economic understanding of oppression. For the politicized theology, women's concerns are seen as analogous to those of the economically oppressed. Women are included by extension in God's preferential option for the poor. However, there are also feminist voices in the Quebec Church. Reflections on women in the church began to emerge in women's writings in the late 60s and early 70s, although in a form which is best seen as embryonic. Various women criticized the church's clericalism and authoritarianism, the marginalization of women in its structures, the failure to respect women's sexuality, and the narrow moralism of traditional Catholicism. Vatican II created important hopes with regard to women's concerns. Early feminist voices were optimistic. They foresaw women's ordination by the year 2000, and they expected an imminent breakthrough on the question of contraception. Unfortunately, it rapidly became clear that these hopes were misplaced, and many women felt that the council left women and the church with much unfinished business. These early feminist voices shared much in common with their male counterparts. These common features include the critique of clericalism, a positive attitude towards the changes taking place in Quebec society, hopes for renewal of the church, and a certain frustration with the pace of change. Many progressive women shared the broader liberationist perspective, which characterizes the Christian left in the 70s. Thus, we find in their work a use of class analysis, the naming of oppression as the source of poverty and powerlessness, the option for the poor as a central tenet of Christian faith, and the turning towards a dialogue with liberationist theologies throughout the world. The late 1970s and early 80s saw the emergence of Francophone feminist theology as such, university-based theology, I mean. One source for, not only, but including, one source for this scholarship is the University of Ottawa's Interdisciplinary Center on the Study of Women in Religion in Canada, whose work has been largely directed by Elisabeth Lascelles. Lascelles' own work has focused on women in the ecumenical movement and the development of the interdisciplinary study of women and religion. And I think it's interesting to note that we tend to appropriate her, but Lascelles is actually a Franco-Ontarian and proud of it. Another vital source of feminist theology is the feminist collective L'Autre Parole, which would translate roughly as the other word. Monique Dumais, perhaps its best-known member, has written extensively about women and the church in Quebec, and she has made important contributions to a constructive feminist theology. Other feminists, under the direction of Anita Caron and Marie-Andrée Roy, have turned their attention to the sociological study of women's place and aspirations in the church. The women working in the area of feminist theologies each bring her own distinctive accent to the work at hand, yet they share many points in common. All mix intellectual, activist, and ecclesial concerns. Likewise, they all concur in their criticism of the patriarchal vision which has dominated the Christian tradition until now. They all speak of the need to enlarge this vision so that it is more inclusive of women's experience, and they argue that such a revisioning is possible within Christianity. Feminists have thus initiated an ongoing dialogue in the church, seeking how women can occupy the existing spaces from which they are now excluded. They have taken on the difficult intellectual task of challenging theological spaces, both epistemological and methodological. Finally, they have displayed a consciousness of the activist dimension of feminist theology, recording and reflecting upon the experiences of women organizing in theological circles and in the church. And perhaps to add a word of this, when the Pope put out his letter on the restriction of ordination to women, it was a touching moment for me and for many feminists in the church in Quebec. And it's Marie Lavigne, who's the president of the Conseil pour le statut de la femme, which is the equivalent of the Canadian Council on the Status of Women in Ottawa. In the magazine which they published, her editorial lead was on her admiration for women in the church who continued to struggle for their dignity and their equality. And I think that sort of recognition speaks of what is happening in Quebec Church and in Quebec society on the women's question, and explains why Monseigneur Turcotte, being named, Archbishop Turcotte and Cardinal Turcotte, on hearing that he would be a cardinal, could answer reporters saying, well, we have to allow the way people think to evolve in order to solve the women's question, but we have to keep dialoguing on it. I don't think that the sort of triumphalism that one might have found in other parts of Canada over the refusal by the Pope to ordain women is possible in Quebec on the part of the hierarchy. Throughout the many changes which have affected the church and society in Quebec during the last 30 years, the church has maintained its commitment to preach the gospel to Quebec society as a whole. Refusing to privatize Catholic faith, the church has refused to withdraw into the security of a Catholic ghetto. It has thus shown that it is possible for the church to make important sacrifices for the greater good of the society which it serves, to listen to new voices and make a place for them within the believing community, and to discover new ways to live out the gospel. Yet, as we approach the new millennium, important challenges await the church. Some of these challenges arise from unresolved questions as a result of the historical coincidence of the Quiet Revolution and Vatican II. Others arise from new ecclesial and societal contexts. The women's question remains largely unresolved. The change that has happened has been real, but it has been slow and painful and generally not enough. The creation of just working conditions for women within the church in ministry is not only an economic consideration. Ways must be found to recognize the full ecclesial worth of women's ministry, to institutionalize their equality with men in other forms of ministry, and to ensure the church's overall commitment to their spiritual well-being. Only then will we be able to say that women in ministry are true partners in the church and truly co-responsible for its future. Sexuality is another challenge which the church cannot ignore. Indeed, it is the major point of conflict at this point between the Quebec church and its society. Most observers admit that there is also a great distance between the official teaching of the church and the everyday choices of most practicing Catholics. And I know this isn't just a situation in Quebec. Caught in an outdated language, too many in authority in the church cannot acknowledge this situation publicly. Yet the church thus hinders its ability to develop and preach a credible sexual ethics in response to the contemporary crisis of values. So too, it accidentally repels people who do not know how to read between the lines of its double language. A bishop admitted to me that he didn't think that the low birth rate among women working for the church was due to some sort of statistical anomaly in their fertility rates. I won't say which bishop. Many observers affirm that there is a growing distance between Quebec Catholics and Rome. For if the historical coincidence of the Quiet Revolution and Vatican II facilitated a positive attitude towards secularization, this same coincidence explains why the spirit of renewal which Vatican II unleashed was so enthusiastically received by so many Quebecers. Yet, ultimately, the post-conciliar period disappointed many, and many more are disheartened by the reemergence of an authoritarian and dogmatic polity within the church. Fewer and fewer Catholics in Quebec look to Rome for leadership, but rather to their bishops, who thus find themselves caught in a not-so-friendly crossfire. If this unfortunate situation is not to end in a practical schism, a great deal of political wisdom and patience will be required. Another question facing us is that of authority, not only within the universal church but within the church in Quebec, and how we can democratize the structures. We have been consulted, we have had commissions, we have had diocesan synods, but the question remains of whether, when we are listened to, what we speak is effective and whether it gives results, and many practicing, active Catholics doubt more and more about this. A different sort of challenge arises out of the increasing pluralism of Quebec society. With the publication of the Dumont Report, the Church of French Canada became the Church of Francophone Quebec. They were originally given the mandate to study the church in French Canada, but finally all of the work was done only in Quebec, thus leaving out Francophone Ontario, Acadia, and so on. But the growing diversity of ethnic origins among French-speaking Quebecers and the growing awareness among English speakers of their identity as Quebecers means that the Quebec Church is now challenged to move toward a broader understanding of itself as a territorial church, inclusive of the experience of all Quebecers. There is some hope that events such as the Diocesan Synod in Montreal will be the catalyst for such a shift in self-understanding. A more difficult challenge is that of the deconfessionalization of the school system. Many observers agree upon the desperate need in Quebec for a common school system as the basis for social and linguistic harmony. The Quebec bishops already support in principle the move from confessional boards to linguistic boards, but they have failed to make this support practical and effective. The repatriation of the tasks of evangelization and sacramentalization, especially of children, to the local Christian community is necessary to the growth of a society without deep ethnic cleavages. Finally, let me express my optimism about the future of the Church in Quebec. The strengths which the Church has developed over the last 30 years have prepared it to meet the challenges which lie ahead, and even more, the justice agenda, which has become central to the Church's corporate identity, will allow it to shine as a beacon upon a hill, witnessing to the coming shalom of God. Thank you.
I'd be glad to hear them. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Where do I situate Archbishop Turcotte as in terms of the spectrum of bishops in Quebec is maybe a good place to go, and I think that I would certainly not see him as anything more than a centrist. Montreal is, of course, a very important diocese. Quebec's the primacy of Canada. But because of the size of Montreal and because of its ethnic diversity, it's a very important archdiocese. There's two possible reasons why Couture didn't get a red hat. I don't know if I want to say this on recording, but anyways, one is questions about what he said and whether this is a reaction to what he said at the Synod, which would assume that he was going to get it, and then he didn't. The other possibility is that the Pope has decided, in order to give more hats elsewhere, not to give many in Quebec, or in Canada, as a matter of fact, because what I notice is there's now no English-speaking cardinal from Canada who will be able to vote next time around, as things stand right now. Because the two cardinals who can participate in the college are Gagnon, who's a part of the Roman Curia, and Turcotte. But in wanting to spread it around to the Eastern Bloc countries, the former socialist, communist countries, and the South, that the Pope decided not to give many in Canada, and since there are two cardinals in Quebec City and in Toronto, to give it to Montreal, where the last cardinal has died. Turcotte is been present certainly at things such as last spring when the Quebec bishops got together with trade unions, credit unions, the Quebec Manufacturers Association, the grassroots organization, which is the equivalent of Action Canada, the Women's Federation, to put out a statement on economic development, given the impoverishment that's happening right now in Quebec. He was certainly there. He certainly made that sort of statement, but he's not the sort of person who's tended to go down and work alongside grassroots organizations, which Couture is and has done. So that in 1984, when there was a march a walk from Quebec City to Montreal around the issue of youth unemployment, Couture walked the first day. Sokrat's not that sort of man, but he's also not a reactionary, and I wouldn't even call him right-wing. I mean, he's a very centrist sort of person, very pragmatic. I suspect it's just that the Pope didn't think that Montreal should go without a hat. Go ahead. I'll start asking you questions. I don't think they're so marginal that they have no bearing. I think in many ways, in discussions I've had, that they would find their experience in some ways surprisingly similar in terms of the questions of women and justice, in terms of the question of commitment to a engaged Catholicism, as that of the rest of the Catholic Church. If only because they've been working with Francophone Catholics for so long, and with bishops that are within that way of seeing the church. They also haven't been experiencing, it's unimaginable in Quebec, the incidents that have happened at St. Mike's and at Regis in Toronto, where a woman theology professor is reprimanded by the local bishop for preaching at a Eucharist intended for her students. I tell this to people and they say, oh, that's just Toronto. No, I don't know if that's just Toronto, and I don't know if in Winnipeg they'd say that's just Toronto. I'm not sure that the Archbishop of Winnipeg is that much more progressive on these questions than the Archbishop of Toronto. But people in Quebec really don't understand it. I don't think that the English Catholic community would understand it anymore. On the other hand, the English Catholic community is a double minority. And I want to be careful because I think it's very dangerous to talk about Anglophones in Quebec as a minority as if it was the same thing to talk about Francophones in Quebec as a minority, and in Ontario as a minority, but numerically. But Anglophone Catholics are a minority within that numerical minority. Anglophone Protestants have had, in Montreal, for instance, the Protestant School Board, which has been basically an Anglophone board that happens to have French schools for those few Francophones who are either Protestants, whatever they are, or Jehovah's Witnesses who don't want their kids in the Catholic schools, or strong atheists who don't want their kids near a Catholic school with a crucifix, or some other version of this. And so Francophones have been Francophone Protestants have been minorities within the Protestant School Board. Anglophone Catholics have been minorities within the Anglophone school boards, which means that in the reorganization of the school boards into English boards, Anglophone Catholics are very concerned about the fact that they're now going to find themselves as minorities within the Anglophone linguistic school board, and they're not sure what to make of the Protestant Anglophone board, or the Protestant board has been a bit more secular on what to make of that. They're worried about losing their community cohesion, their community identity. Anglophone Catholic parishes are full. And the reason for that is that's where the community meets. Just like if you go to Toronto, to one of the Francophone parishes in downtown Toronto, the one Francophone parish, it's the only place in Toronto where once a week you can find 500 Francophones speaking French, having coffee together. And the Mass can be as boring as can be, and the priest there is, let me promise you, is no liturgical stuff. I don't even think he'd claim it, though he's very nice. But that's where you go. So the English Catholic churches function in that way. The other question, though, is the immigrant population and what we call the allophone, by which no single person is an allophone, but all those collective realities that speak languages other than English or French. Right now, there's a lot of rethinking going on. It's what I was trying to allude to, into how do we deal with this within the church. The 19th century model was immigrant parishes, and a lot of people feel that that helps to create cleavage in the society, and that we need to find a way to both be attentive to the needs and help people arriving from other places to create community and to give them a chance to come into contact with Catholics from Quebec. And so that's a big question. I know it's going to be a question on the next synod. Now that too is going to affect the Anglophone community, because one of the things that's tended to happen until 1960 very clearly is that immigrants then moved into the Anglophone Catholic community, for instance, the Italian immigrants. What happens now? Does that mean that there's no other influx into those communities? And I think there's a lot of questions around that, which I think shows that the question of the future of Quebec and how we think about the church are deeply connected. That questions like where children are going to be sent to school, in what language they're going to school, is related to where they're going to end up later in the church. And so I think those questions have to be thought about together. Michael? Radicals may be a strong word. I think one of the things that has happened in the Church of Quebec is that the bishops have taken very seriously the theology of Vatican II that says the local church is important. By local church, I don't mean a little parish, I mean the diocese. And that the bishop is the key person in this thing. And that therefore, I mean, I've heard a bishop say that it's through our communion with our bishop that we're attached to Rome. And there's no notion of so there's a total loss of any ultramontanism that was present in the Quebec church in the 19th century. It's a very Gallican church at this point. And I think that's an important thing to understand what happened. Raymond Dumais was a theologian who taught in Rimouski, who signed a letter that was signed by 75 theologians in Quebec, written to the bishops of Quebec, saying that the bishops should be careful in their interpretation of the encyclical on the splendor of truth, because that the type of errors that are listed therein weren't the type of thing that you found going on in Quebec, and that Quebec theologians were very committed to nuanced ways of thinking about things, and the simplest forms of the arguments presented in the encyclical just had no basis, at least in Quebec, in reality, which left, well, maybe the Pope's got a legitimate concern, but it's in the States, it's in Latin America, it's in Asia, who knows where this is going on, but it's not here. In the meantime, the Pope named Raymond Dumais bishop. Now, somehow, between the time when his name got sent to Rome and they did their little, CIA, RCMP security check, and his naming, this thing happened and they missed it. I think that's the best answer. Well, the a newspaper, or a rag, called L'Informateur Catholique, which is influenced, among other things, by Opus Dei in Quebec, very conservative. I don't think that the Catholic Reporter ever got that conservative newspaper. Wrote right away to the papal nuncio saying, look what's happened, this is going to destroy Episcopal unity, it's going to destroy the apostolic succession, this person can't be ordained. Well, the nuncio, being a good nuncio, didn't want these lay people getting involved, so he told them to butt out. But he also managed to have Dumais called to Rome. So Dumais went to Rome, had a very typical Roman audience, I'm told, where he was told to show up early in the morning and they didn't see him till lunchtime, and then didn't hear anything. Well, then the next thing I heard, and these are, of course, what I've heard, I don't have the proof, so I don't know if I should be should be saying it on tape, is that Rome was still worried. And so they decided to consult the Quebec bishops one by one. Well, the next thing I saw, I can tell you happened. I was at the press conference for the annual bishops' meeting, and one of the journalists there was very aggressive, rightly so. He knows a news story when he saw it about this thing. And one of the bishops finally said, look, his ordination is going to take place such and such a date. We're all going, and we've chartered a plane. As far as I can tell, not a single bishop in Quebec didn't support this person being ordained. I've heard rumors that somebody at the Vatican thought maybe they could go find some questions in the English Canadian bishops, but I understand that the English Canadian bishops saw it fit to respect the wisdom of their brothers in Quebec. I don't know exactly how that came about, but that seems to be the case. And so he was ordained about a month later than it was originally thought, and with a great deal of support from the other bishops. And we have one more bishop who's young, who's dynamic, who thinks, who does theology, and who is in a diocese that has Gaspésie, which has a 25% unemployment rate, large problems of regional development. It's basically the Maritimes. And I think the importance of having a bishop committed to thinking and to social justice in a diocese like that is very important, because it's part of what we call a Quebec broken in two. We don't have an NDP. No, let me be more serious. I don't know how these, I don't go to their meetings. I don't know much about how they negotiate these things among themselves. Obviously, Toronto has had resistance, not just with Ambrosic, but with its previous archbishop, towards the social justice agenda. We saw that in 1983 when the Ethical Reflections on Unemployment was published. The Quebec Bishops' Theology Committee has just published a document on the justice question called l'engagement. L'engagement des communautés chrétiennes dans la société, the implication of Christian communities in the society, in which one clearly sees the influence of thinkers like John Sabrina. I think that Quebec bishops would reject totally that this is some sort of NDP socialism disguised as theological reflection. What they're concerned about is how do we announce the good news of what I prefer to call the shalom of God rather than the kingdom of God, and its justice, in a way that makes our society move forward. Now, part of that may just be a difference. There's a refusal to become a ghetto, a refusal to see the church as a bulwark where you can escape from modernity and kind of turn in on yourself among the Quebec bishops. I don't think they really can imagine that. I think there's also, the Quebec bishops are players in their society, and they see themselves as players in their society. The reflection paper that was put out last spring that I mentioned on economic development was initiated by the Quebec Bishops' Assembly, which means they went and brought together the union people, the business groups, the women's groups. They went and invited them to sit down with them around the table and to think about the future of Quebec society, to think about how we end poverty in Quebec society. And we have an unemployment rate of 12%. To think that we can preach the gospel without worrying about that seems to me unrealistic. But I don't know if in Toronto, I don't know what to say. I suspect that Ambrosik's own political training has been very lax. Doesn't seem to me, what I've read of him, that he seems to have a very sharp development of his political thought, and sometimes he mixes up the categories. So I think that the position that was taken in 1980 will continue to be the position. In 1979 and 1980, the Quebec bishops published 2 letters on the national question in which they said, and this is another heritage we have, they said the time has passed when the church is going to tell people how to vote. That's over. I mean, the church did it under Duplessis. It was quite clear. We suggested who people should vote for from the pulpit, and people went and voted for that person. And Duplessis went on a retreat every year, and everybody loved him. And he gave his archives to the diocesan seminarians, Trois-Rivières. That time is over in Quebec, so they're not going to tell people how to vote. They did at that point try and articulate some principles for talking about the future of Quebec society, some principles about what needed to be discussed. 75% of the bishops are separatistes. I'm not sure of the figure. That many of the bishops are strong nationalists, yes, but you have to remember that not all strong nationalists are independentists, not all sovereigntists are independentists. But that they see Quebec as a distinct society, and that they think that that distinct society has to have the means to determine its own future is very clear to me. Assuming, I don't know if any of us, I don't know if any of us can assume that or know that. It's very unclear for me what the question is going to be between now and the end of 95. I think there will be a referendum between now and the end of 95. If the question was clear and was a question on independence, it's clear to me that's going to take time to work out. The joke in the newspapers in Quebec is that what the majority of the population wants is a strong Quebec and a united Canada. But that doesn't seem to be among the options right now. So what do we do? And which side do you choose on? Will people opt for a strong Quebec, independent Quebec, in the hope that this will force the possibility of a strong Quebec and a united Canada? Maybe. So it's hard for me to even imagine that part of it. It's very clear, though, if Quebec were to become an independent country, that they would have the right to a bishops' conference of their own. There are tensions, and I don't know enough about them. But those who've been closer to the bishops' conference than I have assured me there are tensions, and there have in the past been tensions. Some of those tensions have been worked out so that when people prepare to go to synods, they often, there's the Quebec bishops and their people, and then there's the English Canadian bishops, and they put it all together, but there's a respecting of jurisdiction. The dismantling of the social justice office, for instance, at the CCCB, it's not totally dismantled, it's still there, but the weakening of the social justice office at the CCCB seems to me has hurt the Church in English Canada much more than it's hurt the Church in Quebec, because in Quebec there is a functioning bishops' conference or assembly that has the mechanisms for dealing with social justice. The English Canadian Church as a whole hasn't got anything like that. Maybe it means that the CCCB will be able to function as a national conference. There's a sense in which I think that the question is no longer what does Quebec want. I think the question is what does the rest of Canada want for itself? And maybe we need to look at, or you need to look at, is how are the English Canadian bishops being part of answering that question? What does the rest of Canada want for itself? What vision of immigration does the rest of Canada want? And we look, and the only official opposition we hear is the Reform Party. Is that what you want? What do you want to do about the Maritimes? What do you want to do about growing unemployment? What sort of relationship among English Canadians or Canadians in the rest of Canada do you want? What's the vision of Canada? And then, Quebecers have ideas about who they are and what they want. Then maybe we can sit down and see how it works together. But I think we spent an awful lot of the past 30 years worrying about what Quebec wanted. In a funny way, it's time for English Canada to say, what does it want? For itself. Not for Quebec, not with Quebec, but for itself. It's a bit, Lise Bayette likes to take the example of the divorce. Well, I think I take the example of the marriage counselor, and if there's a point in a relationship where you have to send each person off to their own corner and make them think about what they want, who they are, and where they're going, before you can try and see if they can have a collective project. And so I guess I come back to the question of how are the English Canadian bishops being part of that? And I don't really see them doing well, I have to admit it. Mike? Maybe we should talk also about the relationships between the Jewish community and Mordecai Ruxer. No, but I think that's important to say that several people in the Jewish community several leading people in the Jewish community have been very critical of Religieuses. Anti-Semitism. Well, I was going through some old issues of Relation in my office one afternoon, as I do every once in a while. When you publish a magazine that's 53 years old. You never could have read it all, but it's nice every once in a while to sit down and look back. I came upon some articles, and I think this is a better way to talk about that question that sent me for a loop. One of them was a defense of Pétain, published while he was on trial. Another one of them, which I guess I find interesting given what's going on in France around Mitterrand. I don't know if you've been following that, but Mitterrand was involved with Vichy France before he got involved in the resistance, and there's been a lot of talk about that in France. The other thing I came upon was this article in which we explained that Zionism wasn't really the right way for the Jews because it was a materialist way of seeing the future of the Jews, and that the real answer to what the Jewish people had suffered in the Holocaust was to become Christians. So, now, I wasn't alive when all of this was going on. I thought, I better find somebody who was. So I went and got an old Jesuit who lives in the house where we publish, whose name is Stéphane Valiquette, who was one of the pioneers between Christian-Jewish relations. I said, what is this stuff? He said, who wrote it? So I told him the names. He goes, oh, them. I said, oops. He said, I went through three stages. My first stages was praying for the conversion of the Jews. So I used to send out when we were in novitiate and such. I should mention that Père Valiquette had been a Shabbatskoy. He had, before, as a child, which means he was, the local Christian who did all the, shoveled the coals and stuff on the Sabbath for his Jewish neighbors. So he had come into the novitiate with an interest in Judaism, and praying for their conversion. And he said, I'd send out these little notices saying, please pray for the conversion of the Jews, and I'd get back these hate letters. I was praying for their conversion. He says, there was anti-Semitism. Was Gru anti-Semitic? Yes. Was his use of the notion of race racist? I'm not convinced. In the sense that I don't think his notion of race was biological. He would appeal to the French-Canadian race the way now we might appeal to the Canadian people to kind of draw out why we should be doing finer things in the world. I don't think that for Gru at all it was a biological term. I've read Deleuze's thesis, the book. She forces her arguments. She destroys her case almost by overdoing it. I think that what's more interesting is the things that are going on right now around the Bermanville case. Bermanville was a Vichy official who came to France after the war and got a great deal of support. In part because I think in Quebec there was a lot of confusion about Pétain, what Pétain did, and whether or not Vichy France was actually collaborationist or if it was just a way to get the best deal possible when you'd lost the war. And since Georges Monteron, who was a former resistance fighter and the publisher of the prominent left-wing Catholic weekly in France, Témoignage Chrétien, assures me that there's a lot of French Catholics who have the same problem, and left-wing French Catholics. I'm not sure that that's necessarily a sign of anti-Semitism, but they weren't smart about it, and they weren't critical about it, and they were operating in a Catholic worldview in which Jews were to be prayed for. I mean, it took Auschwitz to take us out of that. All of us. And I don't think Gru maybe made that turn, that virage as quickly as he should have. And it's terribly painful because Gru gave birth intellectually to all sorts of people in the church who went on to do the Quiet Revolution. I mean, he encouraged and supported outspoken intellectual voices when not many people were doing that. People like Michel Chartrand. You may remember Michel Chartrand, who was the union leader, who was in jail for 3 months during the October crisis. Chartrand was an early protege, when he was in his younger days, was a protege of Greuze. I mean, so it's very hard to separate that all out. And as an editor who's been trying to separate out the question of Hutus and Tutsi in Rwanda, and what sort of human rights trials there should be, and whether the FPR is a good or a bad thing, I guess I understand that more in a way that when you're in the history, at some point you have to shut your eyes and make the decision and do it, and leave history to judge you. So yeah, I don't feel I need to defend Greuze, but I don't also think that we need to deny the good things he did do. I can't say that collectively it was a double whammy. If anything, I think it was the grace of God. If one looks at what could have been the response to secularization in Quebec, one only needs to look at the deep cleavages in France between those who defend laïcité, which is a secular society, and those who were Catholic, and the sort of reactionary Catholicism, with Teilhard's family waiting for the return of the monarchy, with Mitterrand thinking if it's anti-communist, it must be good and becoming part of the Vichy government because he came from a very distinguished, profoundly Catholic society, with the sorts of resistance to modernity that have existed in France. If Vatican II hadn't happened at the same time as the Quiet Revolution, that's where the Quebec Church would have gone for its responses. I mean, we're a Francophone-speaking country. And that's where we would have gone for our responses to modernity. And I think that would have been tragic. And I think it would have ended up with what you have in places like Toulouse and Bordeaux, where less than 1% of the population considers itself Catholic. I think it's very important that it happened at the same time. Doesn't mean that there weren't people who found it hard. I really think, though, the real tragedies came among those people who thought Vatican II was going to open up all the doors. I'm talking about men who were ordained, accepting celibacy because they thought it would change. I'm talking about women who really believed in the year 2000 we'd have ordained women working in the church. I'm talking about people who became involved in all sorts of base community experiences, expecting that to be the future. I'm talking about, it's one of the mysteries of history for me. Do you all know what I mean when I say Catholic action? You all are familiar with things like young Christian students, young Christian workers. Some of you may have been involved in it in Southern Ontario because it was here, though it's not as strongly as in Quebec. When you read the Vatican documents, there are very wonderful things said about Catholic action and about how Catholic action teaches the church about how to be in relationship to the society. Throughout the world, the bishops went home and destroyed the Catholic action movements. Stopped funding them, started trying to control them. I don't understand it. I've never understood it. But the people in the Catholic action movements who thought that Vatican II meant that the work they had been doing was the way the church was choosing for the future were bitterly disillusioned by that. I mean, people whose faith is still wounded because of that. I think the ability of the bishops to speak out of both sides of their mouths has often wounded people. I think the expectations about the participation in the church or something like that. I don't mean the introduction of parliamentary democracy, but ways of making decision-making which would take it out of the hierarchy has disappointed people. I think the fact that much of the energy, the wonderful explosion of energy we've seen in the church, not just in Quebec but elsewhere, of lay people working for the church, has been taken to be used as a substitute for clerical ministry, has been disheartening. And I think that's where the pain has been in the Quebec church. I know that there's people who miss the Latin Mass and they're individuals, but I don't think that's a major thrust. Oh no, that 40% living together, period. Like, if you count all, Statistics Canada has just published this statistic, it's amazing. If you take and count all the people living in couples in Quebec, 40% of them are common law. I was surprised to find out that 6% of those over 55 are common law. I think that represents several things, and I think we're going to need to have to, I haven't seen any sociologists do a study of it. Civil marriage became possible in Quebec in the 1970s. Until then, there was no civil marriage. You had to be married in a religious institution. That means that there's not a tradition of going in front of the justice of the peace. In addition, we all know that divorced Catholics form new relationships. Many of those people do not experience civil marriage as true marriages. So therefore, they form new couples, but they don't go through any legal procedure, especially if the legal procedure made it hard to, divorces are not nice, and people sometimes think if you get out of legal procedures, they'll be nicer. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but people don't remarry. People also, and I don't have the statistics, young people live together, and then suddenly, 7-8 years later, they decide they're ready to make a commitment, which means they're actually taking Christian marriage very seriously. They're taking Christian marriage to mean something more than living together, as some sort of more permanent, more mature decision. So that's also happening. So all of that needs to be thought about and worked about. But nobody that I work with, and none of the priests I work with, were surprised by this statistic. They knew it. The rules and the regulations. So what do you do when the president of your parish council is not married and living with somebody and they have 3 kids? In Quebec, people say, well, that's something new. We'll have to see what that means. And they work with her.
I think, as you can ably see and have heard tonight, Carolyn Sharp is one of the sharpest commentators on the Quebec scene in the country. She brings a wealth of learning, theological, sociological, and historical, to bear. It's obviously a liberationist critique that she applies, and is welcome as such. But it's not uncritical, it's highly critical. Her familiarity with the church in Quebec is particularly impressive because she's not a native-born Quebecer. She's a Quebecer by adoption. And what she brings with her scholarship and her professional life as a journalist is something that we need a good deal of and don't see a great measure of in Southern Ontario, and that's passion. Whether it's Gaelic or otherwise, it's passion. Passion for the truth and passion to understand. Tonight, in great measure, Carolyn Sharp has helped us to understand the reality of Quebec, a reality owed and yet new, dismal and yet full of hope. Thank you, Carolyn. We're going to be publishing in Grail Carolyn's address this evening with some changes, hopefully in either the March or the June issue, so we'd encourage you to pick up your copy of it at that time. There is one lecture coming in a couple of weeks' time called The Faith of Feminists by Catherine Zapponi. It will be on a Monday night, not the traditional Friday night slot, still at 7:30, and still, thank God, free. So we'll see some of you then. Good night.